About 20 years ago was my first version of this topic. I had been thinking the Historical Society needed to do something more historical, like a lecture series. And now I have Entertaining History. I didn't think of the name, that was out of committee. But in the fall of 1996, I was at a course in the history department of UND, and the professor is in the room, and it was really interesting. It was something like Great Britain from 1815 to 1945. And one of our assignments was to write a paper on Victorianism. And there was any aspect of Victorianism, and we were given a definition of what this was. And so the Victorians, you had to protect your reputation, you had to live within your means, and all these things of Victorianism. And so I wrote my paper, I handed it in. This time of year, anybody that's associated with the university knows the relief of handing in that last paper, and now you're done, and Christmas is coming. And so my family and I went to pick up some Christmas decorations at Menards. And I'm standing in Menards, my daughter's looking around, she was still in kindergarten back then, and I'm looking at these decorations on a shelf. And it's the Dickens Christmas Village. Victorianism. I was driving my family crazy with Victorianism. Every movie that came on, oh, look, the Jane Austen movie, that's Victorianism. They have to protect their reputation because the little sister is going to disgrace the whole family, and they roll their eyes at me. And so I'm standing in Menards and I'm looking, hey, the Victorian Christmas, isn't this cute? Or whatever. Anyways, just keeping it to myself, thinking and I go around the corner, and the next thing I see is Santa Claus, and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and Frosty, and all of our American cartoon classics. And I paused for a minute, because after spending some time in the history department, you don't think like normal people, you analyze things all the time. And so I was there, wait a minute, there's something going on here. If I go back to the other aisle and see the Dickens Village, the Victorian Christmas, the Victorians were the world's first superpower. The sun never set on the British Empire, and their culture then was dispersed around the world. So their Christmas carols, their Christmas traditions, but other aspects, like there's a reason why some of the greatest cricket teams are in India or Pakistan, because they learned the game from the British when they were there during their colonial time. So, okay. I'm figuring this out, I'm thinking I'm pretty smart, but then this other thing, Santa Claus and Frosty the Snowman, well, that's another thing clicks. After World War II, the United States is the world superpower. And with our bases around the world since then, the culture of the American Christmas has spread around the world. And so, okay, I thought, I'm very clever, and we go on home and we get on with life. And the next year at Christmas time, I kind of thought of this again, and eventually I started buying books and reading books. This one is a good one. This was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. It's called The Battle for Christmas. And we learned that as long as there has been Christmas, there has been a battle about how it ought to be properly celebrated. And so that's part of the thesis of this book. And over time, I collected quite the library of Christmas history books. And as Sue Ellen Bateman was our president during the recovery from the flood and our negotiations with the Corps of Engineers, and I was telling her that we should do some sort of a historical presentation, a new program. And she says, great, and you'll be the first one. And it was December. And I thought, oh, what the heck, I'll just throw something together. And here I still have my notes from that first presentation on Christmas, and I divided it into pre-Victorian or ancient Europe, Victorian and American. So with Christmas, if we go back 2,000 years, if we look in the scriptures, the Bible doesn't tell us the date when Jesus was born. And the early Christians weren't really thinking about when Jesus was born, they're thinking about salvation. They're thinking about the afterlife. When we celebrate St. Nicholas Day, and I'll be talking about him in a little bit, it's the day that he died. It's the day that he entered into heaven is St. Nicholas Day. And so over time, and these early Christians too, they're learning the good news. They're expecting Jesus coming back any day now. But time goes by and a generation passes and another generation. And by the 3rd century, there are Christians who want to celebrate the birth of Jesus. And some of the early artwork, there is, and I couldn't find it again, of course, but somewhere on the internet I saw a picture of a very ancient relief showing the Magi, and Epiphany was very important. There was sort of a debate. Is the day of Jesus' birth the most important, or is Epiphany the most important thing when the Magi, the wise men arrive? And so, on my clicker, so we begin. So, at this time of year, in December, around the time of the solstice, there have been different celebrations. The Romans celebrated the Saturnalia, and the Saturnalia was like a harvest festival, and it was a multi-day festival. And right after the Saturnalia came the Colons of January, Kalends. The Colons was the beginning of a new month, but the January Colons were special because it follows the great celebration of the Saturnalia. And the Saturnalia was a lot of fun. There was drinking, there was carousing, there was gaming. The well-to-do would give gifts to their servants or to people in need. And so for the Romans, this was a great thing. And the Romans spread their culture throughout Europe. So perhaps some of the Saturnalia festivities ended up in France, in the British Isles, thanks to them. If we go farther into Europe, then we have more specific solstice celebrations. And those of, when my daughter Angie was little, I don't know if you remember, about 20 years ago, on the History Channel, they had a series of documentaries about the barbarians. They had the Visigoths and the Goths and the Vandals. And I tell her, that's us, we're the barbarians. And then as it got farther on into the Vikings, and of course with our proud Norwegian heritage, but maybe not so much celebrating the violence, but the... Sure you can. Okay, we'll go with that. So, in the fall, at the harvest time, they would be harvesting the crops, they would put aside the grains, the barley, they would put up hay for the animals over the winter time. They would, in their preparations for the cold winter months when the growing season is done. And the barley would get mashed up and put into to ferment. And by the time December rolls around, a lot of that work is done. And so it's time for the celebration, the return of the light for the solstice. And they had, with their goats, their sheep, the animals that they had, they couldn't put up enough forage to keep them alive all through the winter and keep them healthy. So in December, when it's the coolest month, that would be the butchering time. And so the excess animals, they would have the butchering, and conveniently around the same time, the beer that they mixed up in the fall is ready to go, and so they're ready for the party. So there's plenty of meat, there's feasting, there's fun, nobody goes to bed hungry, everybody enjoys the return of the light of the solstice celebration. They would also decorate their homes with evergreen boughs. And evergreen boughs, these are representative of everlasting life. Also, if you think about it, if you're a Viking or a Norse family living in close quarters with a lot of people, sometimes some of those livestock come into your house. It's not going to be very fresh smelling in the wintertime, but just think about when you get your fresh Christmas tree and how it perfumes the house thanks to the evergreens. That's something I'm sure was appreciated in the log houses at the time of this winter celebration. The early Christians, as I mentioned, they're starting to think about wanting to celebrate the birth of Jesus, and they're starting to worry about a heresy might develop. Some of the bishops believe that Jesus became divine when he was baptized into heaven. Others argued, no, he was divine while he was still in the womb of the Virgin. I'm not going to argue, but this was what was discussed in those early times. But what they decided, the church fathers, okay, people want to celebrate Jesus' birth, we'll go ahead and do this. So in the middle of the 4th century, they recognized Christmas Day. And it was a timing of organizing, developing the church. The Council of Nicaea was formed to try and sort out some of the more intricacies of what the beliefs were going to be, what was acceptable, what was going to be official. The services that they had were long, they were in Latin. It wasn't about joyful times, it was really about paying our respects to Jesus, to God, and the earthly suffering. Still, that wasn't the point. They focused on the afternight life. You lived a good life, and then you could enter into heaven and be with Jesus and the Father. So St. Nicholas is around during this time. It's believed he may have been at the Council of Nicaea, but he doesn't seem to appear on any official rosters. His name isn't written down, but he was the Bishop of Myra, which is on the Turkish coast today. And there are legends of St. Nicholas' secret gift giving during his lifetime. He's the patron saint of many groups and causes. I have a list of some of them, if I get the right page. He was the patron saint of sailors. He was the patron saint of unmarried people, which seems kind of odd. He was the patron saint of children. He was the patron saint of merchants, archers, brewers, woodcutters, repentant thieves, and students. So students this time of year, think about them. St. Nicholas is watching over them too. So I think the cult or the love for St. Nicholas is because partially the location of where he was, the Bishop of Myra, and there's easy transportation, and so news could spread. So somebody has a story about this poor man had 3 daughters and he had no money for their dowries, and he was afraid that they were going to end up prostitutes because there was no way that they could support themselves. And by miracle, St. Nicholas snuck into the house overnight and put some gold into the house, and now there was money for the dowry and the girls were saved from prostitutes. So that's one of the stories attributed to St. Nicholas. But I think the gifts for children are probably what we prefer to think about in our day when we think of St. Nicholas. A shrine was built for him at the church of Myra, but a few hundred years later, it was broken into. Some sailors from Bari on the coast of Italy got in and swiped the relics of St. Nicholas and brought them and built a shrine at the church in Bari, where supposedly these relics still are. And they weren't simply thieves. They thought, officially, they were rescuing these relics so that the Muslims wouldn't be able to capture these important relics of St. Nicholas in Myra, which is present-day Turkey. We move into the Middle Ages, and Christmas is catching on a little bit more, but the observance was led by the royal courts. So the well-to-do, they would plan the celebrations around Christmas, long services in churches again, but then the people would go home and kind of do whatever celebration they wanted to do, especially in the rural areas, because that's where a lot of these more traditions from the pagan days managed to kind of hold on. So celebrating, maybe they weren't specifically celebrating the solstice, but usually in December there would be a celebration, and they continued to celebrate. And some of the church officials figuring, they're going to have their celebration anyway, we might as well go ahead and let them attach it to Christmas, and then we can maybe sort of have a little control over the merriment that's about to ensue. The lords of misrule would be elected. There was feasting and drinking and games, role reversals, and music becomes more and more important. But a lot of these feasting and drinking, games, role reversals, this is reminding of what was happening during the Saturnalia when the Romans were having their December festival. So a lot of it is sort of continuing, whether they knew about it in Northern Europe or not. Speaking of the Middle Ages, Christmas, the 12 days of Christmas in England was established by Alfred the Great, the King of Wessex. It was his dream that England would be a unified country. He never saw it in his lifetime, but that is Alfred the Great, why he's considered great, that he wanted all of the kingdoms to be under one rule. St. Francis. And so if we get into Italy, St. Francis, he was actually born Giovanni. His father was a merchant and well-to-do, and he was away in France on business when Francis was born, and his mother named him Giovanni. And Dad came home and he was not pleased about this. He wanted his son to be named Francesco because he loved France and the people in France, and so he changed the name of his son over to Francis. And he grew up fairly well-to-do. His father was able to provide for the family. He and his friends enjoyed themselves, drinking and making merry and all of that. But eventually he had a conversion, he had a dream, and he started to believe more and more that God wanted him to devote himself to the poor. And so he gave away all of his possessions, he renounced his family, he started attracting followers to his way of life, dedicating, he would meet a poor person who had nothing, he would give him his shirt off his back and just go on and suffer. But people would share food with them. They wanted to be like the disciples. They weren't actively begging for food. People would see them and they were holy people praying for them, and they would share with Francis and his followers. But for our Christmas, he is the one who created the nativity scene in 1223. And he had this idea, again, in a rural area, and to make the people understand more about Jesus being more like them. And so the idea of the poor child born in a manger, surrounded by the animals. So his first nativity scene was set up in a cave. He received permission from the Pope to do this. He wasn't a radical. Well, he was kind of a radical, but not as far as the rules. He checked, and okay, this was sanctioned. So he created a nativity scene, set up in a cave. He got some village people to be Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus. He went around and he borrowed animals to set up the scene. And then he preached and he read from the Gospels about the birth of Jesus and the Holy Night, and that the baby Jesus was humble and poor, just like them. And this was a tradition that, especially among rural folk, they liked it. They had a connection to it, and it spread and spread and spread and comes down to us to this day. I was hoping to have a little nativity scene to show you, but I didn't make it out to the antique store this week. Things didn't work out. But also, in the medieval times, the monks. And the monks in the monasteries, they wrote poetry, they created chants over time, and these chants were pretty basic, but it was, to the glory of God. They transcribed scriptures, they decorated the scriptures, and in time, these poems that they wrote eventually were rediscovered by later people and set to music and became the basis for some of our favorite carols over through the time. And Christmas carols. Caroling is the oldest of our Christmas traditions. People have been singing, and along with those celebrations, the early carols were written in Latin and Greek by the monks. If they were put to music, it was a Gregorian chant or a plain song. Some of the earliest to survive, the March of the Kings. I went online this week and I listened to it. It was rediscovered in an old hymnal in northern Germany somewhere, about around 1700, and set to music. And it sounds a little bit Russian to me. I don't know why. It's a march. It was kind of neat. It's a little bit sort of in a minor key, but I liked it. I would add it to my Christmas list. O Come, O Come, Emmanuel is another of the very old ones that in time was reset to more modern music that we would recognize. And the golden age of carols, the 1400s, the 1500s, I saw three ships. I didn't know this one when I was a kid growing up. But in 1983, at Christmas time, I got roped into being in my one and only theater production in my life. Red River High School was putting on Christmas Carol, and they needed a fiddler for the dancing scene in Fezziwig's house. I got the job. And so backstage, the magical singers were practicing, and they would, in between scenes, they would come through and sing the older hymns, and that's the first time I knew of I Saw Three Ships Come Sailing In on Christmas Day. And I kept thinking, does that really have to do with Christmas? But it's one of the popular ones that comes down through hundreds and hundreds of years. Deck the Halls, another one that's been sung for centuries. The First Noel, which is a French carol translated into English. And one of the all-time favorites, God Rest You Merry Gentlemen. Some of these carols are believed to have originated in Wales, because Wales was more remote and farther away from the big cities, and so they were kind of left alone by the authorities. A lot of the older, more pagan, yearly, annual, like harvest celebrations and things kind of continued as they always had. And these early songs that they would sing continued until somebody came along and it's like, this is really good, and brought it out to the mainstream. And so that time period is Christmas is getting bigger and a little bit bigger until the Reformation hits. And the Puritans had no sense of fun. They had no, well, like you needed me to tell you that. But no merriment, no Christmas. The Bible does not say that Jesus was born on the 25th of December, and they were pretty much changing over the annual calendar. If any of the Catholic holy days were taken off, there was just only Jesus. The Bible only says that we're supposed to keep the Sabbath. All these other days, no. That's all Catholicism. We're not going to follow that. They outlawed Christmas in 1647. Oliver Cromwell. A few years later, the Puritans in Massachusetts did the same, so Christmas was illegal in Massachusetts and so the New England villages, but not so much down like in Virginia, the southern colonies. They were more Anglican. They didn't have this whole issue with the correct means. They were all right with the way the Anglican church was set up. But the Reformation also includes a German guy, Martin Luther, and luckily for us Lutherans, he liked Christmas. In Germany, of course, we learned that this is where the custom of Christmas trees comes from, around the Strasbourg area. Before Louis XIV claimed the area for France, it was German. It's gone back and forth. But the Christmas trees are traced back into that region. And Martin Luther is credited with the custom of putting lights on the Christmas tree. So he was inspired, he was walking through the woods on this beautiful night and the stars were so bright in the sky, and thinking of Jesus, the light of the world, he came home and, as the story goes, brought his family and his children and put candles on an evergreen tree to light the tree. And this is where our lights on our Christmas trees come from. The Catholics adopted the custom later, according to my books. I'm not picking on the Catholics, just reporting what better scholars have put down on paper. So, after the Reformation, things are kind of starting to come back. Over in England, you've heard the song, not so much a carol, Here We Come A-Wassailing. And it sounds like this wonderful, harmless little thing, Here We Come A-Wassailing. And before the Reformation, it was something that over the years, again at the rural areas, the lord of the manor at Christmas time would share with his tenants, and they would have a feast. He would provide them with wine or wassail punch or whatever it was that they liked to drink in their area. And it was all right. Charles I is said to have told his nobles to go back home to their estates and to share Christmas with their tenants on their properties. So this was something that was considered charitable and good. But when the Reformation takes that all away, and then it comes back, it's sort of like America after Prohibition. You take away people having their beer and their spirits, and when it maybe comes back a little bit too enthusiastically, and so wassailing kind of got a bad name. You could be arrested for aggressive wassailing, which sounds kind of hilarious for us, but it was especially for the Puritans and the more like increased mather, cotton mather. They didn't like the over permissiveness that some people were in favor of during Christmas time. 18th century Christmas. So now, as far as whatever church you belong to, they've pretty much come to the resolution that Christmas is here to stay. And so how are we going to sort of control this thing? What is the proper way of celebrating Christmas? Again, we have the battle for Christmas, but it's the interruption of the great carol writing and the pre-Reformation Christmas. Well, it's also further complicated by the French Revolution. And so once we get over all of these upheavals, particularly in Europe, the 18th century Christmas and 19th is going to be more joyful. The second great age of carol writing is the 1700s and the early 1800s. Joy to the world and hark the herald angels sing. We've got the great composers, Haydn and Handel, applying their talents to these songs and to other of those poems that were discovered in some of the old monasteries. And when I'm waiting for the service to begin, I'm always, at Christmas time, paging through the hymnal. When was this carol written? When was that carol written? It's kind of my nerdy history thing that I can't let go. And Christmas in America, the northern colonies, it was more of a solemn occasion. There was a little bit of gift giving, maybe within the family, but it wasn't a big deal. As I mentioned before, in the southern colonies, there was more celebration with feastings. Groups would travel from house to house. So they'd load up into the wagon and go to the next family over, and they would have a drink with them and sing some songs, and then that family would jump in the wagon and go to the next house. And Maymarie Blackmore asked me about if I had heard, and I can't remember if her term was knickerbockering, that they would do it out at Emerito when she was a girl on the farm. And the neighbor would come and they would have whatever refreshment was at Maymarie's house, and then they would jump in the wagon or load up their own wagon and go around from neighbor to neighbor. So this is something that was actually happening 100 years ago right here in Grand Forks County. John Smith is reported to have celebrated Christmas with the Native Americans in Virginia. So a little bit more permissiveness in the South than in the Puritan North. New York is pretty important to our Christmas holiday. Washington Irving, and he wrote a Knickerbocker's History of New York. Am I getting this right? I was working on this part of it kind of late last night after I was disappointed from the hockey game because I lost my original PowerPoint that I made many years ago, so I had to come up with a new one. But in his Knickerbocker's History of New York, he wrote a bunch of short stories. In there we have Rip Van Winkle, and there's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He also writes a little bit story about St. Nicholas, and that kind of gets picked up by other authors and inspires other stories, including Clement Clarke Moore, who lived in if you're familiar with New York City, Chelsea, New York, was where Clement Clarke Moore's farm was. He is, of course, the author of A Visit from St. Nicholas, or, The Night Before Christmas, thank you. And he was on his way to town to purchase a Christmas turkey. And as he was going with the rhythm of the sleigh or something like that, he got this poem in his head. And as soon as he got home, he wrote it down. And it was intended for the entertainment of his children. He wasn't expecting this to be any kind of a big thing. Especially, he was trying to write more important epic poems and things like that. This was just a piece of fluff that he threw together for the kids. But some of the important evolutions that come from his story, yes, it's to entertain children. He changes the date of St. Nicholas's visit from St. Nicholas Day to Christmas Eve. That's a biggie. And then also he gives us a description of Santa's appearance, with his nose like a cherry and his belly that shook like a bowl full of jelly. This is a scan I made from a copy of The Night Before Christmas that Wes Rogers has had in his family for many years. Wes is on our board, he isn't here today, but his copy is from 1894. And a few times he's brought it in its special box, and I've had it on display out in the Calma House during our open house. Not the last couple of years, but maybe he forgot about it. But this is something that is from here. Well, I guess I can go on from there. Also, more Christmas stories. A Visit from St. Nicholas, that was written in 1822. It was first published in the Troy Sentinel newspaper in 1823. And then over time it got picked up and was put into other newspapers as the spread of publications went across the country. So did the story, and he became a little bit famous. Later on, another family claimed that no, it was our dad who wrote the story, but the scholars have gone back and forth and pretty much have come back to Clement Clarke Moore as the true author of A Visit from St. Nicholas. Then we have Charles Dickens back in the old country in England, and he was also inspired by one of the stories you read in the Knickerbocker's History of New York. And so what was going on with this Knickerbocker's history and some of these other contemporaries were that they were trying to get away. We'd gone through the American Revolution, so we're Americans. We want to get away from these English traditions. We're not English. Well, maybe our grandparents were, but we're American. And so they want their own sort of things. And so in New York, they're sort of focusing on the Dutch history of New York. And so St. Nicholas, even throughout the Reformation, St. Nicholas remained popular. He was the third most popular saint in Christendom. There was Mary and Joseph, and St. Nicholas was number 3. And even in the Protestant countries, Germany and in the Netherlands, St. Nicholas remained popular in spite of the Reformation. And so the Visit from St. Nicholas with Clement Clarke Moore, they're kind of projecting onto the Dutch that they had a better sort of Christmas spirit, for lack of a better term. But I'm a descendant from those Dutch people in New York, and most of our records are in the records of the Dutch Reformed Church. And the Dutch Reformed Church wasn't any more merry than the Puritans, really. So a lot of this speculation on their part that there was all this celebration for St. Nicholas and these other traditions of the Dutch really isn't exactly there. But Charles Dickens, he picks up on a story that inspires him to write about Ebenezer Scrooge and the ghosts that visit him and help him discover the true meaning of Christmas. He wrote it in October of 1843, put it into publication. It came out December 19th, 1843, and it sold out by Christmas. And he lost money because it was pretty elaborately produced, and he didn't charge enough per copy, per book, to actually make a profit. You would think that you would want to kind of do the math before you decided what you were going to sell your new book for. So the book went out, and then he had to come out with another edition, and then people pirated his story. And so then he sued because they stole his story, and the lawsuit cost him £500, and so he lost money again. So although A Christmas Carol is this great success over the centuries, personally it was kind of a frustration for Charles Dickens. But he did go around doing readings. He was popular for that, so could sell tickets in the whatever theater. He even came to America and did readings in American theaters of his story, A Christmas Carol. But that's how he made money off of it. It really wasn't from the publishing rights. But he wasn't completely off. He wrote other Christmas stories and created a whole new genre of holiday books. So books and stories centered around Christmas time, and that's where Charles Dickens figured he'd make his money off of that first book. You know, if you write a really good first one, then your fans will buy all your sequels after that. So Christmas celebrations. This is an illustration that appeared in a newspaper in England, I forget which one. This is Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and their children around the Christmas tree. Queen Charlotte is, according to my authors, the first royal to have a Christmas tree in England, and her husband was George IV. But here is Victoria with her family standing around the Christmas tree. Illustrations like this are important. We're developing new traditions, and in the 1800s, printing costs are getting lower. Mail service is improving. Now I'm talking about the United States, but I'm assuming in Britain as well. Publication subscriptions are more affordable. People are making a little bit of money. It's apparently in the 1840s, they're a little more affluent, and so they're taking on subscriptions on magazines. But ladies like this. They get this magazine, and here's a picture of somebody's Christmas tree. Oh, honey, we have to get a Christmas tree. Look at the picture. These magazines would share recipes and activities that you might want to do with your family and with your children. So but particularly the illustrations are important. Now look at this picture. It's the same picture, but an American took away, it's the sash of Albert isn't there. It's a collar of his vest. Her tiara is gone. We no longer have a king and queen. This is an American family standing around their Christmas tree, which an American publication swiped it from the Brits. So also Santa Claus. These publications, again, are contributing to our belief in Santa Claus. This is Harper's Weekly, and if you can see, there's Santa Claus right here. And he's got looks like a woolen cloak, he's got stars all over it, he's got striped pants. He's visiting the Union troops during the Civil War. Because of course we know the Confederates are only going to get coal for Christmas. But this is an early illustration by Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast, actually I learned this week, came from the same village as my German great-grandfather, Landau, in Bavaria. And as a boy, he came to America with his family and became one of the best illustrators in American history. Here's a picture of him. His creations: the Republican elephant, the Democrat donkey, and Santa Claus. This is his Santa Claus. This is the great Santa Claus before the 20th century. See his nice round belly? And the way that the shape of his belly is mimicking the shape of his pipe. So going back to the Dutch again, these long pipes like this are a sign of affluence. And so the well-to-do merchants, the Dutch merchants, would have these pipes. But then they would break and they'd get a new pipe. And in the picture on this book, and afterwards you might want to take a closer look, but this little feisty Santa Claus has a broken off pipe. And it's telling us that he is more of the common people. So the people who couldn't afford the big stemmed pipes, well, they would find one of the broken off ones and they would smoke those. So it was sort of showing off your status as being kind of the tougher, lower classes. Santa evolves some more. Thomas Nast tells us that Santa's workshop is at the North Pole. We never heard that before. We didn't get that from Clement Clark Moore. And he also created Santa's list of who's naughty and who's nice. And I think parents across the country were just like, this is great. Now we could make them get out there and milk those cows, otherwise Santa's not going to come. 20th century, advertising, movie, radio, television, it all affects Christmas. And this is getting into now what we experience as Christmas. And here is pretty much our Santa Claus. And this is the Coca-Cola Santa. Again, thank you to the advertising executives, but it's a good Santa. I like this one. He's probably my favorite, but I like Thomas Nast's also. He's more, still has a little bit more of the old world about him, but this guy, Santa Claus is American. World War II, so I'm going to kind of veer off the path and just kind of go into some of our pictures. World War II is important at Christmas time too. So many of our young people were overseas and thinking about home at Christmas time. And this one particularly usually chokes me up. I hope I get through it. But Meet Me in St. Louis. It's one of my favorite movies. Every time it's on, I have to watch it. It's got a scene from it. All of the seasonal holidays. It's got Halloween. It's got Easter. Christmas time is, of course, the great part at the ending. And this is where the song Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas is introduced for the first time. And it's 1944. And next year, all our troubles will be out of sight. Still beats me. But one of my favorites, also World War II, Merry Christmas, White Christmas is actually what I was looking for, but I kind of like this picture, so I went along with him. Bing Crosby in a movie called Holiday Inn introduced White Christmas, and then later on in the 50s, the Great Extravaganza with Danny Kaye and Rosemary Clooney. And it's corny, but I watch it anyway. It's Christmas time, and so holiday movies is also, for myself anyway, something that I look forward to that helps me to get into the holiday spirit. Also, our beloved cartoon characters, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. This was the first book, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, came out in 1949. An employee with Montgomery Ward, Bob something there, I've got him written down. But he came up with this story, and they put out the first printing, like 100,000 copies, and they just flew right off the shelves. And 1939, 1940, 1941, World War II interrupts. Montgomery Ward, after the war, gave back the rights to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer to its author, and then he sold the rights and become a more nationally publicized book. And then in 1964, the animated classic, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, comes on television. And the moral of the story here is it's a youth who saves the day, Rudolph, and he's also somebody who's got a little bit of a handicap. There's something that people don't like about him. He's a little bit different, and that's okay. He becomes the hero of the story, and that's the great theme to take away from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Then we got our other ones that follow. We've got Frosty. We've got our Peanuts Christmas. Bonnie's our great fan of Snoopy over here with her sweater that you got in the store. Your battery must have died. The lights weren't good. But so yeah, so these are the stories that I grew up with, look forward to every year. They'd be on CBS or ABC, and now we've got cable TV, and you never know what channel your show is going to be on, or if it's going to be on at all. No, they're going to be on a streaming service or this or that. You have to just make sure. And it's not the same if you have a DVD and pop it in. No, you have to watch it when it's on. That's my thing anyway. Other movies that we have, Miracle on 34th Street, once again, is from the perspective of the little girl who doesn't believe in Santa Claus, but then comes to believe in Santa Claus, and it's something more. It's a Wonderful Life, which was James Stewart's first movie after World War II. And I'm sure you all know, he was a bomber pilot during the war, and when he came back, he didn't, before World War II, he was in a lot of screwball comedies and that sort of movies. And he didn't know that he wanted to go back to that sort of life. He's grown up now, he's seen too much, he's, fought with all these amazing servicemen. But Frank Capra talks him into being in this movie. And it starts out as, a guy wanting to commit suicide. Isn't that just holiday cheer right from the first scene? It wasn't, when they were making it, they weren't intending it to be a Christmas movie. It was just the story of this guy who goes after frustration throughout his whole life, but he remains faithful to his community, faithful to his family. And finally, it gets, it's just one straw too many. And then the miracle happens, and his angel comes and saves him. When It's a Wonderful Life came out, it was a flop at the box office. They released it at some odd time of year. I think it came out in like January. Well, who's going to watch it? Well, it's winter time, but no. They tried releasing it a little bit. A few months later, still no, didn't make any money. Put it in the vault, and it sat, and it sat, and over time, its copyright expired. And then, we've got television stations across the country. This movie is in the public domain. We can show it for free. And they showed it, and they showed it, and they showed it until people got so sick of it. And the late night comedians are making fun of it. But it really catches on in spite of itself. And now, I don't know how they managed to have one network show it once per year after all of that, but somebody that understands the legal things with the movies, I guess, will have to figure it out. But anyways, It's a Wonderful Life has become classic. And after our family gathering, we go home, and usually that's what's on and we watch, and that's kind of part of our celebration.